The photograph was never supposed to survive. The image was never intended to last. Taken in 1892, in the remote mountains of West Virginia, it shows a family gathered on the porch of a decaying cabin, greater than captured in 1892 within the isolated West Virginia mountains. It depicts a family assembled on the porch of a dilapidated cabin. At first glance, it's just another sepia-toned relic of Appalachian life. Greater than initially, it appears to be merely another sepia-colored artifact from life in Appalachia. But look closer. Greater than, however, examine it more carefully, count the fingers. Greater than, tally the digits. Notice the eyes. Greater than, observe the eyes. Some blue, some brown, some a disturbing shade of amber that shouldn't exist in nature. Greater than, a few are blue, others brown, and some are an unsettling amber hue that seems unnatural. The children's faces carry features that seem almost familiar to each other in ways that make your skin crawl. Greater than, the children's facial features bear a resemblance to one another that is so close it becomes disturbing. This photograph was hidden in the basement of the Beckley Historical Society for over a century, for more than 100 years. This picture was concealed in the basement of the Beckley Historical Society. The archivist who found it in 2003 initially thought it was a mistake, some sort of photographic error or manipulation. Greater than, when an archivist discovered it in 2003, their first assumption was that it was an error flaw in the photographic process or a manipulation. But the records that came with it told a different story. Greater than yet, the documents accompanying it revealed a different narrative, a story of 7 generations of a family so isolated, so determined to keep their bloodline pure, that they created something that was never meant to exist. Greater than was an account of a family spanning 7 generations, who lived in such seclusion and were so committed to preserving their bloodline's purity that they brought into being something that should never have been. Hello everyone. Greater than greetings, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. Greater than, before we begin, please remember to like and subscribe to your channel name and drop a comment below telling us where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. This helps YouTube continue to recommend stories like this one to you. What you're about to hear is the real account of the Witmore family, though that wasn't always their name. The story you are about to hear is the true chronicle of the Witmore family, although they haven't always gone by that name for nearly 2 centuries. They lived in the most remote hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, following a twisted philosophy that would ultimately destroy them from within. Greater than, for almost 200 years, they inhabited the deepest valleys of the Appalachian Mountains, adhering to a distorted belief system that would eventually lead to their internal collapse. This isn't folklore. This is not a folktale. This isn't legend. This is not a myth. These are documented records that government officials tried to bury, medical reports that were classified, and testimonies from the last surviving witnesses who are now all dead. Greater than, these are verified documents that authorities attempted to suppress, confidential medical files, and accounts from the final living witnesses, all of whom have since passed away. The story begins in 1795, when Jeremiah Witmore first arrived in what would become Beckley County, West Virginia. Greater than, the tale commences in 1795. With Jeremiah Witmore's initial arrival in the area that would later be known as Beckley County, West Virginia. He brought with him his wife Sarah, their 3 children, and a belief system so radical that it would consume his family for the next 7 generations. He was accompanied by his wife Sarah, their 3 children, and a set of beliefs so extreme that it would dominate his family line for the following 7 generations. Jeremiah believed that marriage outside the family was a contamination of bloodlines, that only through careful selection within his own family could he create what he called the perfect mountain people. Jeremiah was convinced that marrying outside the family polluted the bloodline, and that only by meticulously choosing partners from within his own kin could he achieve his goal of creating the perfect mountain people. By the time the last Witmore child drew his final struggling breath in 1962, the family had become something that violated every law of nature and human decency. Greater than by 1962, when the last Witmore child took its final, labored breath, the family had transformed into an entity that defied all natural laws and principles of human morality. Jeremiah Witmore wasn't just another mountain settler. Jeremiah Witmore was not merely a typical settler of the mountains. According to court records from the Virginia Territory, he had been a respected physician in Richmond before something changed his mind about civilization entirely. Greater than, based on court documents from the Virginia Territory, he was once a well-regarded doctor in Richmond before an event caused him to completely reconsider his views on civilized society. Local newspaper archives from 1794 mention a Dr. J. Witmore, who was expelled from the Richmond Medical Society for unnatural practices and theories contrary to Christian doctrine. Archives from a local 1794 newspaper reference a Dr. J. Witmore, who was ejected from the Richmond Medical Society due to unnatural methods and ideas that opposed Christian teachings. 3 months later, he vanished into the wilderness with his family. Greater than 3 months after that, he disappeared into the wild with his family. What drove Jeremiah into the mountains wasn't religious persecution or economic hardship. Jeremiah's motivation for fleeing to the mountains was not religious persecution or financial difficulty. It was a twisted interpretation of selective breeding that he developed after studying livestock and disturbingly human anatomy. It was a warped understanding of selective breeding, which he formulated after studying animal husbandry and, disturbingly, human anatomy. In a journal recovered from the family's first cabin in 1943, Jeremiah wrote, "Just as we breed our finest horses with their own bloodlines to maintain strength, so too must human bloodlines be preserved from contamination." Greater than, in a journal found in the family's original cabin in 1943, Jeremiah had written, "To preserve strength, we breed our best horses within their own lineage. Human bloodlines must similarly be protected from impurity. The mountain will be our sanctuary, where the Witmore line will become something greater than nature intended. The mountains will serve as our refuge, a place where the Witmore lineage will evolve into something beyond nature's design." Sarah Witmore, according to her own diary entries, initially resisted her husband's increasingly disturbing ideas. Greater than, according to her personal diary, Sarah Witmore initially opposed her husband's progressively alarming ideology, but isolation has a way of wearing down resistance. Greater than, however, prolonged seclusion can erode defiance. By 1798, 3 years into their mountain exile, she was writing entries that show a complete transformation in her thinking. Greater than, by 1798, after 3 years of isolation in the mountains, her diary entries reveal a total shift in her perspective. "Jeremiah has shown me the truth," she wrote. "Jeremiah has revealed the truth to me," she wrote. "Our children must marry within the family. Our children are obliged to marry among themselves. It is God's will that we remain pure. It is God's desire that we maintain our purity." The first generation of mountain-born Witmores consisted of 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. The initial generation of Witmores born in the mountains included 5 children, 3 sons and 2 daughters. By 1820, when the oldest reached marrying age, Jeremiah had convinced them all that marriage outside the family was not just wrong, it was evil. Greater than, by 1820, as the eldest children came of marriageable age, Jeremiah had persuaded every one of them that marrying outside the family was not only incorrect, but inherently wicked. The oldest son, Marcus, married his younger sister, Elizabeth. The eldest son, Marcus, wed his younger sister, Elizabeth, the second son, Thomas, married their sister, Mary. When she turned 16, the second son, Thomas, married their sister, Mary. Upon her 16th birthday, the youngest son, Nathaniel, would wait until the next generation to find a bride among his own nieces. The youngest son, Nathaniel, would bide his time until the following generation, eventually taking a bride from among his own nieces. What makes this story particularly disturbing is how methodical it all was. Greater than the aspect that makes this account especially alarming is its calculated nature. This wasn't desperation or accident. Greater than this was not born of despair or happenstance. This was planned. Greater than this was premeditated. Jeremiah kept detailed records of births, deaths, and what he called bloodline purity measurements. Greater than Jeremiah maintained meticulous logs of births, deaths, and his so-called bloodline purity measurements. He documented physical traits, mental capabilities, and what he believed were signs of genetic superiority in his growing family tree. He recorded physical characteristics, intellectual capacities, and what he perceived as indicators of genetic superiority within his expanding family lineage. But even in those early records, there are hints that something was already going wrong. Greater than yet, even these initial documents contain clues that problems were already emerging. Children born with extra fingers, others with unusual eye colors, some with learning difficulties that Jeremiah dismissed as temporary impurities that would breed out over time. Greater than there were children born with additional digits, others with atypical eye colors, and some with cognitive challenges that Jeremiah brushed off as transient flaws that would be eliminated through subsequent breeding. By 1845, the second generation of Witmore children had begun producing the third generation, and the warning signs were impossible to ignore, though the family chose to ignore them anyway. Greater than by 1845, as the second generation started having children of their own, the third generation, the red flags became unmistakable, yet the family deliberately overlooked them. Medical records from a traveling doctor named Samuel Patterson, who visited the Witmore settlement in 1847, paint a disturbing picture of what was happening in those remote mountains. Greater than the medical notes of an itinerant physician, Dr. Samuel Patterson, who visited the Witmore settlement in 1847, depict a troubling scene of the events unfolding in those secluded mountains. Dr. Patterson's notes, discovered in the West Virginia State Archives in 1987, described children who were peculiar in both appearance and behavior. Dr. Patterson's notes, unearthed in the West Virginia State Archives in 1987, characterized children who were unusual in their looks and actions. He documented multiple cases of what he called family resemblance, carried to an unnatural extreme. He recorded several instances of what he termed family likeness, pushed to an unnatural degree. Children who looked so similar to their parents that it was difficult to determine their actual parentage. Greater than children whose resemblance to their parents was so strong that establishing true parentage was challenging. More troubling were the physical abnormalities that were becoming increasingly common. Clubfoot, cleft palates, extra digits, and what Patterson described as eyes that seemed to look through rather than at a person. Even more concerning were the growing number of physical deformities, such as clubfoot, cleft palates, extra fingers and toes, and eyes that, according to Patterson, appeared to look through a person rather than at them. The third generation consisted of 14 children born between 1840 and 1855. The third generation included 14 children born from 1840 to 1855. Of these 14, only 8 survived to adulthood. From these 14, just 8 lived to become adults. The family burial ground, later discovered by state investigators, contained 6 small graves with no markers, greater than a family cemetery. Found later by state officials, held 6 unmarked, small graves. Children who died in infancy from what the family called the weakness, greater than. These were infants who had succumbed to what the family referred to as the weakness. Modern medical experts who reviewed Patterson's notes believe these children likely died from genetic disorders that are common results of close inbreeding, heart defects, severe developmental disabilities, and immune system failures. Greater than contemporary medical specialists examining Patterson's notes theorize these children probably died from genetic conditions typical of intense inbreeding, cardiac defects, profound developmental delays, and failures of the immune system. But perhaps most disturbing was how the surviving family members adapted to their increasingly isolated existence. Greater than, however, the most alarming aspect may have been how the remaining family members adjusted to their life of growing seclusion by the 1850s. The Witmores had developed their own dialect, a mixture of archaic English and invented words that made communication with outsiders nearly impossible. Greater than, by the 1850s, the Witmores had created a unique language, blending old-fashioned English with made-up terms, rendering interaction with outsiders almost futile. They practiced their own religion, a twisted version of Christianity that justified their breeding practices as God's plan for mountain people. They followed their own faith, a corrupted form of Christianity that rationalized their reproductive habits as part of God's design for mountain folk. Sunday services, according to Patterson's observations, included prayers for keeping the bloodline pure and protecting the family from outside corruption. Based on Patterson's accounts, their Sunday worship involved prayers dedicated to maintaining bloodline purity and shielding the family from external contamination. The third generation's marriages followed the same pattern established by Jeremiah, but with even more disturbing variations. Greater than the marriages of the third generation adhered to Jeremiah's blueprint, but introduced even more unsettling twists. Brothers married sisters, but now uncles were also marrying nieces, while brothers still married sisters. Uncles now also wed their nieces, and in at least 2 documented cases, fathers married their own daughters when their wives died in childbirth. Greater than, furthermore, in no less than 2 recorded instances, fathers married their own daughters following the deaths of their wives during childbirth. The family had created a closed genetic loop that was becoming increasingly unstable with each generation. Greater than, the family had engineered a sealed genetic circuit growing more volatile with every successive generation. By 1860, when the 4th generation began to emerge, the Witmore bloodline had become so concentrated that children were being born with genetic material so similar it was essentially identical, like human photocopies, that became more distorted with each reproduction. Greater than, by 1860. With the arrival of the 4th generation, the Witmore genetic pool had become so condensed that children were born with nearly identical DNA, comparable to human photocopies that grew more distorted with each copy. The Civil War years brought temporary contact with the outside world when Union soldiers passed through Witmore territory in 1863. The Civil War era introduced a brief period of external contact when Union troops marched through Witmore land in 1863. There, reports filed with military headquarters in Charleston describe encounters with a family they called the Mountain Devils. Their reports, submitted to military command in Charleston, detail run-ins with a family they labeled the Mountain Devils. Sergeant William Hayes wrote in his official report, "We came upon a settlement of perhaps 30 individuals, all bearing such strong resemblance to each other that we initially believed them to be related." Sergeant William Hayes stated in his official report, "We encountered a community of roughly 30 people, all sharing such a striking likeness that we first assumed they were all kin. Upon further observation, we realized they were all related in ways that violated both natural law and Christian decency. Greater than, upon closer inspection, we understood they were indeed related. but in manners that transgressed both natural law and Christian morals. The soldiers' descriptions of the fourth-generation Witmore revealed the accelerating physical deterioration that decades of inbreeding had produced. The soldiers' descriptions of the fourth-generation Witmores showed the quickening physical decline resulting from decades of inbreeding. Multiple family members had what Hayes described as malformed skulls with foreheads that protruded unnaturally and jaw lines that seemed either too large or too small for their faces. Greater than. Several family members possessed what Hayes called deformed skulls, with abnormally bulging foreheads and jaw lines that were disproportionately large or small for their faces. Several children walked with severe limps, and at least 3 adults appeared to be completely deaf. A number of children had pronounced limps, and no fewer than 3 adults seemed to be totally deaf. Most disturbing to the soldiers was what they called the family stare. What the soldiers found most troubling was what they termed the family stare. All the Witmores had developed the same blank, unfocused expression, as if they were looking at something no one else could see. Greater than every Witmore had adopted the same vacant, distant gaze, as though they were seeing something invisible to everyone else. By the 1870s, the fifth generation was producing children who barely resembled normal human beings. Greater than by the 1870s, the fifth generation was giving birth to children who scarcely looked human. A census taker named Robert Mills, who somehow managed to reach the Witmore settlement in 1875, documented his findings in a report that was immediately classified by territorial authorities. A census official named Robert Mills, who somehow reached the Witmore settlement in 1875, recorded his observations in a report that was instantly classified by territorial authorities. Mills described children with grotesquely oversized heads, others with limbs twisted into impossible angles, and several who appeared to possess the mental capacity of infants, despite being adolescents. Mills recounted children with monstrously large heads, others with limbs bent at unnatural angles, and several who seemed to have the intelligence of babies, even though they were teenagers. His most chilling observation was of a child he estimated to be around 12 years old, who crawled rather than walked, communicated only through grunts and pointing, and had eyes of 2 different colors, one blue, one brown, that never seemed to focus on the same object. Greater than his most frightening account was of a child, roughly 12 years old, who crawled instead of walking, could only communicate with grunts and gestures, and had heterochromia, one blue eye and one brown, that never focused on the same thing. The family's isolation had become nearly complete by this point. Greater than by this time, the family's seclusion was almost total. They had no contact with the outside world, except for occasional encounters with lost hunters or surveyors, most of whom left the mountain as quickly as possible after meeting the Witmores. Their only interaction with the outside world was accidental meetings with lost hunters or surveyors, who typically fled the mountains immediately after these encounters. Local Native American tribes had legends about the Cursed Hollow and refused to hunt in Witmore territory, believing the land itself had been contaminated by what lived there. Greater than. Indigenous tribes from the area had legends about a Cursed Hollow and avoided hunting in Witmore lands, convinced the very soil was tainted by its inhabitants. What makes this period particularly tragic is that some members of the fifth generation seem to understand that something was terribly wrong. Greater than. Adding to the tragedy of this era is the apparent awareness among some fifth-generation members that something was horribly amiss. Mills reported finding crude drawings hidden in one of the cabins, sketches that appeared to be self-portraits, showing the artist's awareness of their own deformities. Mills reported discovering rough drawings concealed in a cabin, which looked like self-portraits, revealing the artist's consciousness of their own physical distortions. One drawing, which Mills described as heartbreaking in its accuracy, showed a figure with the caption, "This is me," written in a childish scroll beneath a face that was barely recognizable as human, greater than one sketch, which Mills called heartbreakingly precise, depicted a figure with the words, "This is me," scrawled childishly beneath a face that was hardly human. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most, greater than if you're still with us. You possess more courage than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? Greater than let us know in the comments. What would you have done if this were your family legacy? The sixth generation of Witmores, born between 1885 and 1900, represented the point where human genetics simply began to fail. The sixth generation of born from 1885 to 1900, marked the stage where human genetics started to fundamentally break down. State Health Inspector Dr. Margaret Thornton, who visited the settlement in 1903 as part of a tuberculosis survey, filed a report so disturbing that it was sealed by order of the governor and remained classified until 1978. Dr. Margaret Thornton, a state health inspector who visited in 1903 for a TB survey, submitted a report so alarming it was sealed by the governor's order and kept secret until 1978. Her findings revealed a family that had crossed the line from human abnormality into something that challenged the very definition of humanity. Her discoveries exposed a family that had transitioned from human abnormality to an entity that questioned the core definition of what it means to be human. Dr. Thornton documented children born with severe spina bifida, others with hearts that developed outside their chest cavities, and multiple cases of what she called impossible anatomy. Greater than Dr. Thornton recorded children born with extreme spina bifida, others with hearts located outside their rib cages, and numerous instances of what she labeled anatomically impossible features. Limbs that grew from wrong places, faces with features in incorrect positions, and internal organs that formed in ways that should have made life impossible. This included limbs sprouting from incorrect locations, facial features situated in the wrong places, and internal organs that developed in ways incompatible with life. Yet somehow these children lived. Greater than nevertheless. These children lived. They breathed. Greater than they breathed. They ate. Greater than they ate. They even reproduced, creating a seventh generation that would represent the absolute nadir of human genetic breakdown. Greater than they even procreated, producing a seventh generation that would signify the absolute lowest point of human genetic collapse. The family's living conditions had deteriorated along with their genetics. The family's living situation had decayed in parallel with their genetics. Thornton described cabins that were more animal den than human dwelling with family members who had lost the ability to use tools properly or maintain basic hygiene. Thornton described cabins that resembled animal dens more than human homes, inhabited by people who had forgotten how to use tools or practice elementary cleanliness. The stench was so overwhelming that she had to retreat. Multiple times during her examination, the smell was so powerful that she was forced to withdraw several times while conducting her examination. Most disturbing was her observation that the family seemed to have lost the ability to distinguish between family roles. Most unsettling was her note that the family appeared to have lost all understanding of traditional family roles. Children were caring for adults. Children were looking after adults. Adults were behaving like infants, and the normal social structure of human families had completely collapsed. Greater than adults were acting like babies, and the standard social framework of a family had utterly disintegrated. Perhaps most chilling was Thornton's encounter with the family matriarch, a sixth-generation woman named Ruth, who was believed to be around 40 but looked ancient. Perhaps the most frightening moment was Thornton's meeting with the family matriarch, a sixth-generation woman named Ruth, who was thought to be about 40 but appeared incredibly aged. Ruth spoke in what Thornton described as a language that was almost English, but not quite, and seemed to be the only family member who retained any awareness of the outside world. Ruth communicated in a language Thornton called almost English, and seemed to be the sole family member with any remaining awareness of the world beyond the mountains. During their brief conversation, Ruth told Thornton something that the doctor noted in her private journal, but never included in her official report. In their short discussion, Ruth told Thornton something the doctor wrote in her personal diary, but excluded from her formal report. "We know what we are. We know what we have become," Ruth said. "We know what we've become. But we can't stop. Greater than we know what we are. But we cannot stop. The mountain won't let us stop. Greater than the mountain will not allow us to stop." By 1910, the sixth generation had produced 12 children who survived to reproductive age, greater than by 1910. The sixth generation had yielded 12 children who lived long enough to potentially reproduce. The seventh and final generation of Witmores, greater than. This was the seventh and last generation of Witmores. These children represented the absolute endpoint of human genetic viability. These children symbolized the ultimate limit of human genetic sustainability. They were born into a world where their own family tree had become a closed circle, where every marriage was between individuals who shared nearly identical genetic material, and where each birth was a gamble, with biological laws that had already been pushed far beyond their breaking point. Greater than, they entered a world where their family lineage was a closed loop. Every union was between people with virtually identical DNA, and every birth defied biological rules that had already been shattered. The seventh generation of Witmore consisted of only 4 children who survived past infancy, born between 1920 and 1935. The seventh generation comprised only 4 children who survived infancy, born between 1920 and 1935. Their very existence defied medical understanding, as their genetic similarity was so extreme that they were essentially clones with minor variations. Greater than. Their mere survival contradicted medical science, as their genetic likeness was so profound they were practically clones, with slight differences. Dr. James Patterson, grandson of the original Dr. Samuel Patterson, who had first documented the family, visited the settlement in 1940 and found what he described as the end result of humanity's most forbidden experiment. Dr. James Patterson, grandson of the original Dr. Samuel Patterson, visited in 1940 and discovered what he called the final outcome of humanity's most forbidden experiment. The 4 surviving seventh-generation members were named Jeremiah, Sarah, Marcus, and Elizabeth. Greater than, the 4 surviving members were named Jeremiah, Sarah, Marcus, and Elizabeth, the same names used by the original Witmore patriarch for his children, suggesting that even Naaman had become trapped in the family's endless genetic loop. These were the same names the original patriarch had given his children, indicating that even the practice of naming was caught in the family's perpetual genetic cycle. But these children bore almost no resemblance to normal humans. Greater than, however, these children looked almost nothing like typical humans. Patterson's confidential medical notes discovered after his death in 1987 describe beings who were technically alive but fundamentally broken at the most basic biological level. Greater than. Patterson's private medical notes, found after his 1987 death, describe creatures who were biologically alive but fundamentally shattered at a cellular level. Jeremiah, the oldest, had been born with what Patterson called catastrophic skeletal malformation. T. Greater than Jeremiah, the eldest, was born with what Patterson termed a catastrophic skeletal malformation. His spine had developed in a spiral pattern, giving him the appearance of being permanently twisted. Greater than, his spine had grown in a spiral, making him seem perpetually contorted. His head was enormously oversized with a skull that had never properly fused, leaving soft spots that pulsed visibly with his heartbeat. Greater than, his head was massively large, with a skull that hadn't fully fused, resulting in soft spots that visibly pulsed with his heartbeat. Despite these deformities, he possessed what Patterson described as an unsettling intelligence, often staring at visitors with eyes that seemed to understand more than his malformed mouth could express. Despite these deformities, he had an unsettling intelligence, often gazing at visitors with eyes that seemed to comprehend more than his misshapen mouth could ever articulate. Sarah had been born with her internal organs, partially external, her heart visible through translucent skin, her intestines partially outside her abdominal cavity. Greater than Sarah was born with some internal organs exposed. Her heart was visible through semi-transparent skin, and part of her intestines were outside her abdomen. She required constant care and could only consume liquids. Yet, she had somehow survived to age 20 by the time of Patterson's visit. Greater than she needed round-the-clock care and could only ingest liquids. Yet she had miraculously lived to age 20 by Patterson's visit. Most disturbing was her apparent telepathic connection with her siblings. Most disturbing was her seeming telepathic link to her siblings. Patterson observed that when one of them experienced pain or discomfort, the others would react simultaneously, as if they shared a nervous system. Patterson noted that if one felt pain or discomfort, the others would react at the same moment, as though they shared one nervous system. Marcus and Elizabeth were twins, but twins unlike anything in medical literature. Marcus and Elizabeth were twins, but of a kind undocumented in medical science. They had been born, physically, connected at the spine and shared several internal organs, yet had been surgically separated by family members using crude tools when they were infants. They were born conjoined at the spine, sharing internal organs, but were separated in infancy by family members using primitive instruments. The separation had left both children with severe disabilities, but they had developed what Patterson called compensatory abilities. The separation caused severe disabilities in both, but they developed compensatory abilities. Marcus could only move his left side, Elizabeth only her right, but when they worked together, they functioned almost like a single individual. Marcus could only control his left side, Elizabeth her right, yet when cooperating, they operated nearly as one person. By 1945, it had become clear that the seventh generation would produce no eighth generation. By 1945, it was evident the seventh generation would not produce an eighth. The four siblings were physically incapable of normal reproduction, and their attempts had resulted in multiple stillbirths and miscarriages. The four siblings were physically unable to reproduce normally, and their attempts led to numerous stillbirths and miscarriages. The Witmore bloodline, after 150 years of systematic inbreeding, had finally reached its biological dead end. After 150 years of methodical inbreeding, the Witmore lineage had hit its biological terminus. The last Witmore child was born on March 15, 1962. The final Witmore child entered the world on March 15, 1962. He had no name. It was never given a name. By this point, the surviving family members had lost the ability to perform even basic human rituals like naming their offspring. By this time, the remaining family had lost the capacity for basic human customs, such as naming their children. The child's birth was attended by Dr. Robert Hayes, a young physician who had been hiking in the area when he heard what he initially thought was an animal in distress. The birth was witnessed by Dr. Robert Hayes, a young doctor who was hiking nearby when he heard what he first believed was an animal suffering. What he found in that remote mountain cabin would haunt him for the rest of his life. What he discovered in that isolated cabin would torment him forever. Dr. Hayes' private notes donated to the West Virginia Medical College after his death in 2003 described the final Witmore child as a biological impossibility that somehow drew breath. Dr. Hayes's private notes given to the West Virginia Medical College after his 2003 death, described the last Witmore child as a biological impossibility that nevertheless breathed. The infant had been born with severe hydrocephalus. The baby was born with acute hydrocephalus. His head was nearly twice the size of his body, filled with fluid that made his skull translucent. Greater than his head was almost double the size of his body, filled with fluid that rendered his skull see-through. His limbs were severely malformed, more like flippers than arms and legs. Greater than his limbs were terribly deformed, resembling flippers more than arms and legs. Most tragically, he had been born without a functioning respiratory system. Greater than most tragically, he was born without a working respiratory system. His lungs were underdeveloped and filled with fluid, forcing him to struggle for every breath in a desperate gasping rhythm that never stopped. Greater than, his lungs were stunted in fluid, causing him to fight for every breath in a constant, desperate, gasping rhythm. The child's mother was Elizabeth, the last surviving member of the seventh generation. Greater than the mother was Elizabeth, the final surviving member of the seventh generation. She was 37 years old, but appeared ancient, her body ravaged by multiple failed pregnancies and the accumulated genetic damage of 7 generations of inbreeding. Greater than, she was 37 but looked ancient, her body destroyed by numerous failed pregnancies and the collected genetic harm of 7 generations of inbreeding. She had somehow managed to carry this final pregnancy to term, though Hayes noted that both mother and child should have died months earlier. Greater than, she had somehow carried this last pregnancy to term, even though Hayes noted both mother and child should have died months before. Elizabeth herself died within hours of giving birth, her body simply unable to survive the trauma of delivery. Elizabeth died just hours after giving birth, her body incapable of enduring the ordeal of childbirth. For 18 hours, the nameless child fought for breath in that mountain cabin while Dr. Hayes struggled to decide what to do. For 18 hours, the unnamed child battled for air in the cabin as Dr. Hayes wrestled with what action to take. There was no way to save the infant. Greater than, there was no saving the infant. His deformities were too severe, his genetic damage too complete. Greater than, his deformities were too extreme, his genetic damage to total. Hayes later wrote that watching the child struggle was like witnessing the final desperate gasps of a bloodline that nature had been trying to end for decades. Hayes later wrote that observing the child's struggle was like watching the last, agonized breaths of a bloodline that nature had attempted to terminate for decades. The infant's eyes, Hayes noted, with the same unsettling amber color that had appeared in Witmore family members for generations, but they held what he described as an ancient sadness, as if this child somehow understood he was the end of something that should have ended long ago. Hayes noted the infant's eyes had the same disturbing amber hue seen in Witmore's for generations, but they contained an ancient sadness, as if the child knew it was the conclusion of something that should have finished long before. The child died at 6:23 a.m. on March 16, 1962. The child died at 6:23 a.m. on March 16, 1962, with his final breath. The Witmore bloodline, 167 years in the making, came to its inevitable end. Greater than, with its last breath, the Witmore bloodline, 167 years in creation, reached its unavoidable conclusion. Dr. Hayes buried the infant next to his mother in the family cemetery, where over 40 graves marked the tragic legacy of Jeremiah Witmore's twisted vision. Dr. Hayes buried the baby beside its mother in the family graveyard, where over 40 graves stood as monuments to Jeremiah Witmore's warped vision. The cabin was abandoned, the settlement reclaimed by the mountain wilderness, and the Witmore name disappeared from human memory. The cabin was deserted. The settlement was swallowed by the mountain wilds, and the Witmore name vanished from human recollection. But the story doesn't end there. Greater than, however, the narrative continues. In 1995, genetic researchers studying the effects of isolation on small populations requested access to the Witmore family records. Greater than in 1995, genetic scientists researching isolation's impact on small communities asked to examine the Witmore records. What they found in those mountains wasn't just the story of one family's destruction. Greater than, what they uncovered was more than just the tale of a single family's ruin. It was a warning about the fundamental importance of genetic diversity in human survival. It was a cautionary tale about the crucial role of genetic diversity for human survival. The Witmore bloodline had become a real-world experiment in what happens when humans violate the most basic laws of biology. The Witmore lineage had turned into a real-life experiment, showcasing the consequences of violating biology's most fundamental laws. Their tragic end serves as a reminder that some boundaries should never be crossed, and that nature's laws exist for reasons we ignore at our own peril. Greater than their tragic fate reminds us that some boundaries are inviolable, and that nature's rules exist for reasons we disregard at our own risk. Continue this subcourse. Here is the continuation of the script, paraphrased and with the channel name placeholder. What the geneticists discovered in the 1990s went far beyond a simple case study. Greater than, the findings uncovered by genetic researchers in the 1990s transcended a mere clinical case history. The Witmore family provided a terrifyingly clear example of what scientists call a genetic bottleneck. The Witmore case offered a horrifically precise illustration of a scientific phenomenon known as a genetic bottleneck. When a population becomes too small and isolated, genetic diversity plummets. Greater than, this occurs when a group becomes too small and secluded, causing genetic variation to crash. Harmful recessive genes, which would normally be diluted in a larger gene pool, are instead expressed generation after generation. Greater than, damaging recessive traits, typically watered down in a diverse population, are instead amplified and manifested repeatedly. In the Witmores, this process wasn't just accelerated, it was the entire purpose of their existence. Greater than, for the Witmores, this process wasn't merely hastened, it was the foundational goal of their way of life. They had turned themselves into a living laboratory of genetic decay. Greater than, they had effectively transformed themselves into a living experiment in genetic deterioration. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. Greater than, however, the most alarming revelation was still ahead. When researchers attempted to analyze DNA samples from the family burial ground, they encountered something unprecedented. Greater than, when scientists tried to examine DNA taken from the family cemetery, they faced something never before seen. The genetic material was so degraded, so homogeneous, that it was almost impossible to sequence. Greater than, the genetic samples were so deteriorated and uniform that sequencing them was nearly futile. One researcher compared it to trying to read a book where every page was an identical, faded copy of the one before. Greater than, one scientist likened the task to reading a book where every page was identical, washed-out duplicate of the previous one. There were no distinct genetic markers left. Greater than, all unique genetic identifiers had been erased. The Witmores hadn't just inbred, they had effectively erased their own genetic individuality. Greater than, the Witmores had done more than inbreed. They had virtually deleted their own genetic uniqueness. They had become a single, continuous biological entity, stretched across time, with each generation being a weaker echo of the last. Greater than, they had evolved into a single, uninterrupted biological organism, stretched over generations, each one a fainter reflection of its predecessor. This is why the physical deformities grew so severe so quickly. Greater than, this explains the rapid and extreme progression of their physical abnormalities. It wasn't just one or two harmful genes being expressed. It wasn't merely the expression of a couple of damaging genes. It was the catastrophic failure of an entire genetic blueprint, collapsing in on itself. Greater than, it was the total breakdown of an entire genetic code, imploding from within. The body simply didn't have the instructions to build a viable human being anymore. Greater than the human body no longer possessed the necessary instructions to construct a functional person. The building blocks were there, but the plan was gone, replaced by a corrupted, repeating loop. The components were present, but the blueprint was lost, superseded by a damaged, recurring sequence. So, what happened to the mountain? Greater than this leads to the question of the mountain's fate. The land where the Witmores lived was purchased by the state in 1970 and declared a protected wilderness area. Greater than the state bought the Witmore land in 1970, designating it a protected wilderness zone. The cabins were left to rot, and the forest slowly consumed every trace of the settlement. The cabins were abandoned to decay, and the woodland gradually reclaimed all signs of the settlement. But to this day, hikers and park rangers report strange phenomena. Greater than yet, even now, hikers and park rangers describe unusual occurrences. They speak of an unnatural silence that falls over certain hollows. They talk about an eerie quiet that descends upon particular valleys. They report seeing figures that move with a twisted gait through the trees, figures that vanish when approached. Greater than there are accounts of figures moving with a contorted limp among the trees, figures that disappear when one gets near. Some have even reported hearing a faint, gasping sound on the wind, like a child struggling for breath. Greater than some even claim to hear a faint, wheezing noise on the breeze, resembling a child fighting for air. Are these just ghost stories born from a known tragedy? Greater than are these merely campfire tales inspired by a local tragedy? Perhaps. Greater than maybe. But those who have studied the Witmore case closely suggest something else. Greater than, however, those deeply familiar with the Witmore story propose an alternative theory. They theorize that such a profound and concentrated tragedy, a violation of nature's most fundamental laws, might leave a kind of imprint on a place. Greater than they hypothesize that a violation of nature's core principles, so deep and concentrated, could potentially leave a permanent mark on a location, a psychic scar, if you will, a psychic scar. For lack of a better term, the mountain absorbed the pain, the isolation, and the genetic despair of 7 generations. Greater than the mountain may have absorbed the agony, the seclusion, and the genetic hopelessness of 7 generations. What echoes back might not be ghosts in the traditional sense, but a lingering resonance of a bloodline that broke itself against the laws of life itself. Greater than what people experience might not be conventional ghosts, but a lasting resonance of a lineage that shattered itself by defying the very laws of biology. The story of the Witmores is the story of an idea. The Witmore saga is ultimately a tale about an idea. It's a warning about the danger of purity as an absolute goal. Greater than serves as a caution against pursuing purity as an ultimate objective. In nature, diversity isn't just a nice thing to have. It's the essential ingredient for survival. In the natural world, diversity isn't a luxury. It is the fundamental requirement for survival. Strength doesn't come from being identical. Greater than. True strength does not originate from uniformity. It comes from having a vast toolkit of different traits to adapt to a changing world. Greater than. It comes from possessing a wide array of different characteristics to adapt to an ever-changing environment. Jeremiah Witmore sought to create a perfect, unchanging human. Greater than Jeremiah Witmore aimed to engineer a perfect, static human. In doing so, he made his family exquisitely vulnerable. In the process, he rendered his family incredibly fragile. They couldn't adapt, they couldn't change, and when the world shifted even slightly, they had no defenses left. Greater than they lost the ability to adapt or evolve, and when faced with change, they had no defenses remaining. They were perfect only in their inability to survive. Greater than, their only perfection lay in their total inability to endure. So, the next time you look at an old photograph, remember the Greater than so, when you next examine an old picture, recall the Witmores. Remember that in the subtle variations between Usin are different eye colors, are different heights, our different talents lies, our collective strength. Greater than remember that our collective strength is found in the subtle differences between Usin, our varied eye colors, our diverse heights, our unique talents. Our imperfections are what make us human. Greater than, it is our imperfections that define our humanity, and our diversity is what makes us strong, and our diversity is the source of our resilience. What are your thoughts on this chilling tale? What are your reflections on this unsettling story? Do you believe such a concentrated tragedy could leave a mark on a location? Greater than, do you think a tragedy of this magnitude could permanently affect a place? Let us know in the comments below. Greater than, share your perspective in the comments section. And if you haven't already, make sure to like and subscribe to Fear Lit for more stories that explore the boundaries of history and the unexplained. And if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe to your channel name for more content that delves into the frontiers of history and the mysterious. Thanks for watching. Greater than, thank you for watching.